Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
4 minutes after 10 is the time, and I feel our attention drawn inexorably towards matters of foreign affairs this morning. Chiefly, I suppose, Saudi Arabia and, of course, Russia. The second question, given that it's now increasingly clear, as everybody pretty much knew yesterday, that the former spy taken ill in Salisbury has been the victim of another Kremlin-sponsored assault upon British sovereignty and rule of law. Will they waltz away untouched again, like they did last time? The notion of a nation being able to stand up to the corruption and evil of Vladimir Putin's regime, the notion of a nation relying on Boris Johnson to stand up to this character is, well, if it was someone else's nation, we'd be able to laugh at it, but it's ours. What did he do yesterday? I turned up late for the urgent question and then just said something about football. We'll stick in that in the second hour, I think. How can we punish Russia? And then after 12 o'clock, I'm going to reintroduce you to, or invite back into the studio, two gentlemen from Newcastle who operate under the title Dark Justice and are, in the parlance of the tabloid press, paedophile hunters or vigilantes. You will know, if you're kind enough to listen to this programme on a regular basis, that I really struggle with the idea of private citizens taking the law into their own hands and engaging in a form of potential entrapment. But I like these lads, and I can't imagine a mindset that would say, I'd rather they didn't do the work that they were doing. Conflicted and confused enough yet? You will be. Because we're going to begin by administering what should theoretically be the kiss of death for this whole format of radio. The phone-in format depends upon certainty. I suppose if we were being uncharitable, we'd argue that it depends upon false certainty. I need people to ring me up, convinced that they actually understand stuff and have really strong opinions, because it's such great sport when it turns out that they don't know one end of their phone receiver from the other. So, and then I do certainty as well. I sit here and say, absolutely this is good, absolutely this is bad. I told you that the Americans would offer us an inferior open skies deal after Brexit, and now they have. I told you that you'd lose your roaming charges when you travel to the European Union after Brexit, and it's been confirmed today that you possibly will. But that's boring too, in the context of what I want to discuss today. What I think occurred to me this morning on the way into work is that there isn't really any such thing as certainty. We just pretend that there is. I saw the chap who was driving me in, Martin, alerted me when I got into the car this morning to the number of billboards that he'd seen as he drove around London and its environs, promoting the visit of the Saudi Crown Prince. And I took to Twitter and said, has anyone seen these billboards? And I got bombarded. Then I saw one myself on one of those moving lorries. You know, the lorries that you stick adverts on the back on? The aesthetics of these adverts saying, welcome, Saudi Crown Prince, all words to that effect. The aesthetics of these adverts are probably best described as suburban lap dancing club. It's got that kind of soft focus, purpley light picture of the Crown Prince and some sort of bold text superimposed over the top. It could be like Whispers in Chipping Norton, not Chipping Norton, you wouldn't go to a lap dancing club in Chipping. It could be like Whispers in Basingstoke, that sort of thing. That's what the aesthetics look like. And it's very, very odd. Paid for by them, presumably as a response to some other adverts that have been paid for by people who no doubt describe themselves as human rights campaigners, objecting to the visit of the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince on the perfectly reasonable grounds that the ongoing civil war in Yemen, which was started by, you've got to get this right, Houthi rebels in about, I'm going to get the year wrong, 2015, but which is being continued with enthusiasm by Saudi Arabia, using weapons we've sold them, and is currently responsible for arguably the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet at the moment, the biggest man-made humanitarian crisis on the planet at the moment. They're waltzing in to Britain today. So what you should be able to do, and I think increasingly on both sides of the political divide this holds true. This horseshoe effect that we started talking about a few years ago has come so horribly true that I almost begin to wonder whether we jinx stuff by pointing it out and then watching it happen subsequently. This notion of the two extremes of both sides politically being a lot closer to each other than they are to the rest of us, I think I might have solved it. I think centrist means you acknowledge there's no such thing as certainty, either morally or actually intellectually. You have certainty with statistics. You can count stuff. But actually, when the late Robin Cook talked about an ethical foreign policy, do you remember that? Feels like a different age. I suppose it was in many ways. An ethical foreign policy, and I didn't know what he meant. You sort of presume naively that all foreign policies have at least paid lip service to ethics, have at least tried to involve a concept of decency. What I realise as the years pass is that Robin Cook was actually referring to an attempt at some sort of moral consistency. So if ISIS are the devil incarnate because they routinely behead people, they oppress women, they criminalise criticism, they treat innocent civilians like cannon fodder, they behave in an utterly barbaric and disgusting way, and therefore we encourage each other and our leaders to go and drop bombs on them, we should probably be treating Saudi Arabia in the same way, because they do all of those things I've just described. And while this new fella is being held up as a beacon of tolerance and modernity, his biggest achievement so far on that front is to allow women to drive cars. And we roll out the red carpet for him. You won't be able to make your way from Heathrow Airport to central London today without seeing about a gazillion pictures of him beaming down from the billboards that they've paid for. What? And I know it's an overused adjective, but if that's not Orwellian, I don't know what is. Here's a fellow with an appalling human rights record who heads up a country that treats women as second-class citizens and pretty much everyone who's not a member of the ruling class as serfs. But we're rolling the red carpet out for him on a national scale. Why? Because they spend so much money on British guns, slightly cover-all term, on British weaponry, British advice, British support. They spend so much of their oil money with us that we give them a free pass on the humanitarian stuff. And then in the second hour, when we look at Russia and the reason why we're not punishing them more severely, the short answer to that question is because some of Putin's biggest cronies spend so much money here that to tell them to sling their collective hook would be economically injurious. There's no such thing as an ethical foreign policy. It just depends who's got the best PR, doesn't it? Or which murderous monster spends the most money with us. He gets a free pass, and then the terrorists get a coating. I find this really... depressing is not quite the right word. I find it quite illuminating, this notion that actually there is no such thing as certainty. Because, I mean, moral certainty. Because I can't really come up with a simple explanation of why we treat the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince like royalty. Yeah, because he is James. We treat the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince like our best friend. And leaders of other regimes, I suppose Iran most obviously, which are morally, I think they're morally comparable. I'm not a Middle Eastern expert, but when I was working at Newsnight, I really dug deep into all of this. One of the most moving films I've ever presented was involved an attack upon a factory in Yemen. The journalist who came back from that, Gabriel Gatehouse, one of the absolute best in the business. And that kind of opened my eyes to what was going on there a couple of years ago. And can you really explain to me why we lobby routinely for Iran to be treated like persona non grata and for Saudi Arabia to be treated like our best friend? There's no moral basis to this at all, is there? There's no consistency. There's no ethical foreign policy. The problem is, and this is where anyone who's not upset already by these observations will become upset. I don't know that we've got much choice as a country. Don't you have to break bread with baddies sometimes? And if you're living in a country like this where the media is run more or less entirely by amoral billionaires, while you're breaking bread with baddies, don't you have to pretend that they're goodies? Don't you have to tell the plebs that they're goodies? Don't you have to pretend that there's some massive difference between ISIS or Iran or Saudi Arabia? These essentially Arabic despots who treat their own people with contempt. But some of them are really awful and some of them are good customers. So we'll treat them completely differently, thank you very much, according to how much money they spend in the bazaars of Britain, the arms bazaars of Britain, as opposed to how they actually behave, govern, or treat their own people. And I think, I've been trying slightly to get inside the heads of people who I find politically very dangerous and frightening. Fascists, I suppose, would be the obvious word. But that entry-level fascism, where you try to silence all criticism and you accuse anybody who has empathy of being a snowflake or a wrong 'un, actually, there's a lot. There is a defensible position there. What right does a lefty have to say that Donald Trump shouldn't come here if we're welcoming Saudi Arabia? I felt there was a degree of hypocrisy when we were talking about a state visit for Donald Trump, and some people turned around and said, well, I don't remember you protesting when the Saudi Arabian king came. And I thought, actually, I do remember people protesting when the Saudi Arabian king came, but it was actually a much more nuanced conversation. The reason why Donald Trump is an exception to these rules is because he's supposed to uphold Western values. He's supposed to uphold democracy, transparency, accountability, all the things that we charge ourselves with exporting to the Middle East. Donald Trump doesn't represent any of those things. He would love to be like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He envies Vladimir Putin's ability to lock up critics. In fact, that was one of his campaign slogans, wasn't it? He wants to lock up his political opponents. So that's why it was, for me, qualitatively different. Somebody who is supposed to uphold our values is routinely denigrating and destroying them. So I don't want him invited here. But if we were to be morally consistent, ethically sound, or even close to fair, we'd surely be telling the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince to sling his hook as well. I haven't really asked you a question yet. The phones are ringing, so hopefully you've sort of identified one somewhere within my meanderings. But to be a little bit more specific, what's the difference between the Saudi Arabian regime, the Iranian regime, and ISIS? Well, what makes one a cherished friend and the other national enemy number one? 034 560 60 973. Don't take this the wrong way, but is it possible to conduct this conversation without mentioning Israel, do you think? Let's find out. We are killing the radio phone in stone dead by suggesting that it's impossible to have really strong opinions about most issues if you understand them. Of course, we're living in an age where... Do you know, this is why the denigration of education comes from as well, isn't it? I don't know if you've seen the Sun story today, berating students for suggesting that Frankenstein's monster deserves some sympathy. If you've read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, you'll know that a significant portion of the book is dedicated to explaining why the monster deserves some sympathy. Indeed, the monster himself spends an entire chapter saying that he's only become monstrous because of the way people treated him, and if they'd only been nice to him, he could have been virtuous all along. But under the editorship of Snowflake-in-Chief Tony Gallagher, that becomes an attack upon students for understanding things. And it occurred to me yesterday after the programme, if you're in a room full of people, the ones who've studied the most will be the slowest to claim certainty, won't they? I think Aristotle said the wise man is the man who knows how little he knows. If you're in a room full of people, the ones who've studied the most will be the slowest to claim certainty. The ones who know the least will be the quickest. It's a sort of human condition. Or if you've got 100 people in a room, none of whom know anything, the one who's best at pretending that he does, he'll get 52% of the room behind him, whereas the 48% who understand stuff and are aware of how little they understand, they'll be the ones who are on the side of sort of caution, evidence, learning, experts. And the reason why you can't have certainty or moral certainty is perfectly highlighted on the streets of London today as we roll out the red carpet for the head of a regime which, if we turned the PR around and Messrs Murdoch and his mates decided that we don't like these people, they'd be sort of effigies by tea time. That's what I think anyway. Matthew's in Romford. Matthew, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
I broadly agree with what you say there, because I don't really think... I think the idea of attaching the word ethical to foreign policy, when really foreign policy is just pursuit of the national self-interest on on the global stage.
Yes, but there are ways you can do it. I mean, the national self-interest can be served by doing good, not just by doing bad. Arguably, defeating the Nazis was in our national self-interest, but it was also an act of unalloyed moral good.
Well, I mean, you can look at some what we did with regards to Nazism. So, our policy in the 30s was essentially one where we were trying to set the Bolsheviks off against the Nazis. You could argue that that wasn't a particularly ethical way.
I could and I couldn't, but I didn't mention it. I spoke solely about the defeat of the Nazis after Poland had been invaded and war had been declared. That was an act of unalloyed moral good. Some of the tactics employed, if you look at Dresden and Bomber Harris, you could argue, or even, I suppose, the deployments of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you certainly could make it less black and white morally, but there was good and bad on either side in that war.
Well, we then hung the Polish out to dry by...
which is why I'm not talking about that. I'm talking solely about the defeat of the Nazis in the context of the Second World War. But your point makes itself. It is always nuanced, and it's incredibly rare that you have a battle, particularly on a world stage, that lends itself so easily to good versus evil. What's the difference between Iran, Saudi Arabia and ISIS?
Very little, really, except one has tons of money and oil and also intelligence on security-related matters that they're willing to share and cooperate.
It's widely believed that Wahhabism, the particularly toxic strain of Islamist jihadist ideology, is sponsored by Saudi Arabia. And these are the days where I really wish I'd become a sports journalist or stayed a book reviewer, because if we take that as a given in most conversations everywhere from the EDL right through to the side of the angels, all offer up compelling evidence that Saudi sponsors this brand of Wahhabism, and yet we're supposed to be spooked to our source by the thought of Islamist terrorism, but now we're rolling out the red carpet, and I mean, we practically have carpeted the whole of the A4 for the bloke who runs the country that spawns this ideology and disseminates it to elsewhere in the world. I definitely want to be a sports journalist.
And it's the money that ultimately dictates where the priorities and the loyalties
But
lie.
I don't always think this makes us sound like kind of pastiche Viz characters like militant and right on the student. Do you know what I mean? I do, and I don't like. The thing is, I mean, I'm certainly not left wing by any stretch. I'm not right wing either. I'm somewhere in between. Well, like 90% of the world, but of course, all of our media coverage suggested it's a 50-50 split between left and right,
which it isn't. Yeah.
No, I know.
It is far more nuanced. You've just got lots of people in different. It's just social media has just amplified.
But even though long before that, Robin Cook, social media wasn't even a thing when Robin Cook coined the phrase ethical foreign policy. Would it have been possible?
Where did it get? But where did Robin Cook's ethical foreign policy lead him? I mean, I know.
Well, it led him to resign over the Iraq War. To be fair to the fella, didn't it? If memory serves.
Well, exactly. So, I mean, who led in terms of who laid the guidelines for the foreign policy?
Yes.
It's one of those things where the Foreign Office, all of the civil servants, pretty much everyone there was against the war in Iraq. From my understanding, from my.
I don't know that that's true. Sir John Scarlett, who was the head of the security services, was one of the most ardent drum beaters, I think. But yeah, I mean, there was conflict. The question is, how did that work out for you, Robin Cook? We went to Iraq shortly after you announced that as Foreign Secretary you were going to be employing ethical foreign policy. He wasn't Foreign Secretary when he resigned. I think he was Leader of the House. Matthew, thank you. Who's going to argue with us on this? This is the problem, is what I mean. I've killed off the phone-in show by saying there's no such thing as certainty or consistency. Why are you not protesting about Saudi Arabia coming to London if you don't like Donald Trump? Well, we are. But the difference is clear. One is supposed to represent Western values. One is a sort of barbaric Middle Eastern despot. Okay, so do we treat all barbaric Middle Eastern despots the same? Iran versus Saudi Arabia versus ISIS. You tell me. Mark's in Bayswater. Mark, what would you like to say?
Well, hi, James. Saudi Arabia, since the start of the Yemen war, Britain has made £600 million in arms and bomb sales to them. But the most important point is that they are currently trying to make a decision as to where to float their Aramco oil company, which is worth between $2 and $3 trillion. It's one of the top 5 companies in the world. They're just now trying to decide whether to float it on the Nasdaq.
To float 5% of it, Mark. The IPO, you're right, is looking at a choice of markets. Will it do it in London or will it do it in New York? But I think it's only 5% of the company in the first instance, but it's still a significant chunk of change.
Well, yes, exactly. So therefore, that $6 billion in arms sales and the decision whether to float your biggest company on our stock exchange or the Americans means that the Queen, Prince Philip and Boris Johnson have the morals of the same as the Crusaders back in medieval times. They're bereft of, because what's happened...
Can we leave the Queen out of it? Do you mind? As I get older, I find... No, I'm not having that, mate, you dirty traitor. I'm not. It's absolutely... But bless Her Majesty and all who's sailing her.
No, but she's having lunch with them whilst there's
She's got no choice. She has to do what the government tell her to do. She is literally not allowed to turn around and say, I don't want to have lunch with this clown. He's a right old wrong-un.
Yeah, but you know, genocide...
Boris Johnson, say what you like about, mate, but leave Her Majesty out of it.
All right, Boris Johnson, then, whilst genocide is... with the blockade... Genocide is being carried out in our name with our arms in Yemen because we want to make millions of pounds in cash out of it.
There are some really evil people on the other side as well, and at risk of sounding like a schoolboy, they did start it. But I take your point, and it's not a conservative thing, this, Mark, as I'm sure you appreciate, because I know who you are, even if not everybody listening does. Labour governments embarked on identical levels of hypocrisy. They must all know. Does something happen when you get into power? They give you a little dossier that explains why you now have to treat Middle Eastern despots in a really positive way, because they show you the sums and they say, well, look, if we don't, then we need to find X gazillion dollars by tea time to plug the hole that's going to leave in the British economy. And while we're at it, that's why we've got all the Russian murderers and kleptocrats here as well.
Yeah, you're right, James. That's exactly what happened.
Oh,
it
don't be
seems
daft.
to be that money is the ultimate goal for all of these people, and morals go straight out the window, and they're the same as they were in the medieval empire times.
I find it hard to argue with that, but I would urge you in future to leave Her Majesty out of things. She rises above the fray. The closest she's ever come to a political comment in her entire life was wearing that blue hat with the gold stars on it, giving the Queen's speech in the House of Commons, which was her way, of course, of saying, please don't be stupid and leave the European Union. But unfortunately it was too late, because Michael Gove and his mates at the... was it at The Sun? Had already confected a story claiming that she was somehow in favour of Brexit. It's coming up to 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I have 3 phone lines free. One of them could be yours, where we are examining something that is probably as old as the hills, but which always feels shocking when you return to it afresh. Why are we rolling the red carpet out for the head of the Saudi Arabian regime when we routinely regard the head of, example, the Iranian regime as a force for unalloyed bad? They seem to me to stand comparison with each other, but we get forced into this polarity. Have you noticed? You sort of say, I don't think much of Boris Johnson. Oh, I suppose you want to live in a Hugo Chavez-style socialist state then? No, I just don't think Boris Johnson is very honest. Oh, I suppose you're some sort of communist then. And then the other way around, you say, that Jeremy Corbyn is a little bit off, isn't he? I don't like some of the stuff he's done in the past. Oh, yeah. Well, I suppose that you're a complete Murdoch lackey, aren't you? If you find it, you're some sort of Zionist shill if you don't like Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, well, can I just sort of have a different opinion about things according to the facts as they're presented to me, rather than picking a side before I know any facts? No! I bet Emily Thornberry won't be speaking up against Iran today. No, of course she won't. Because the president of Iran is not rolling down a red carpet at Heathrow Airport today. Oh, yeah. Oh, Donald Trump, yeah, don't see you complaining about Saudi Arabia, but you're complaining about... Well, I can complain about both, can't I? I don't have to pick a side on everything. If you want to pick the side of righteousness, though, I suggest you're going to be very lonely. Which is why I find these guys so interesting, because I think they have picked the side of righteousness. And while I am well aware of the complications and the controversies surrounding so-called vigilantism, or, for want of a better phrase, because it makes it almost sound like a video game, paedophile hunters, Scott and Callum, who we met last year, are among the most interesting people I have ever invited into the studio. And I'm going to invite them back in at 12 o'clock today. You may remember when they first came in, I was keen to meet them. I'd persuaded myself by studying the work that they did that they were a force for good. Some of these vigilantes offer the police and the public profound difficulties when they take the law into their own hands. But these two track down predators, perverts, paedophiles, bring them to the police's attention, and in the main, the police seem grateful. So what they do, they go online with a fake profile and make it absolutely clear that the person they're pretending to be is 14 years old, and then they seek to make contact with the men who express sexual interest in this character that they know to be 14 years old, and then they confront them at the meeting places. Incredibly hazardous, dangerous, potentially injurious behaviour, but, I mean, just the side of the righteous, no? So Martin Lindsay, my colleague, has been in and out of touch with them over the last few months as they pursued and he followed a single case from start to finish, literally from the posting of the profile pretending to be a 14-year-old girl to a guilty plea in court in Newcastle last week. And luckily, Martin had his microphones with him.
Hello, my name's Scott. I'm one half of an organisation known as Dark Justice.
My name's Callum, and basically the same fight against online child abuse and exploitation.
I'm here at Dark Justice's headquarters in a secret location on the outskirts of Newcastle. To me and you, it's a small and very cold office on a rundown industrial estate. There are no windows, it's basic and almost empty.
As you can see, it's nothing special. There's a couple of computers, a heater because Callum doesn't like the cold, and just some chairs and a table, really, and a couple of takeaway boxes and a couple of Coke cans.
What's that, fridge down there?
Yeah, you have to have a fridge. It's an essential, especially when you're working long hours.
How many hours a day and a week do you put into this?
Too many hours, probably about 17 a day. 17 hours a day, and like our schedule goes from normal to hectic. Like we've got a trial on Friday.
We can be caught off guard and have to go and meet at like 2, 3 in the morning, stupid times. It is quite a hectic schedule.
Are you all right to show us how it works then?
In front of me, there are 2 computers on a desk with Dark Justice 1 and 2 set as the screensavers. Scott and Callum use these to pose as children online and then wait for paedophiles to approach them.
I prefer not to say what the website is because we use quite a bit, but...
They're now loading up a profile on a chat room designed for children. They use a photograph of what appears to be an underage girl and then a fake username.
For the purpose of this, let's put Amy F13.
There you go, one straight away. That's within like the first 30 seconds.
After logging in, the profile is then approached within seconds. Each ping you're about to hear is a message from a potential paedophile to what they think is a 13-year-old girl.
See what he has to say.
After less than a minute, a man then contacts the profile and immediately requests a video chat. A new window then opens. He's sat there naked and is performing a sex act on himself.
19 years old, masturbating on webcam straight away. Can't make it up, 13 years old, it's in the name.
You know, we have a young-looking female on there, you know, who could come across as a girl of between 13 to 15. It's got the profile picture on. You'll get people who like the profile picture. You know, they'll even comment on the profile picture, like...
Who is that?
She's a decoy who volunteers for all photographs to be used. She is over the age of 18.
They now have a number of fake profiles open and receive hundreds of messages, many of them explicit.
I'm fine, sexy. I was like, I could say rude things to you. And I went, but I'm 13. And when I know, I went, so it's illegal. And he went, it's only illegal if you tell someone. It's not if you keep it a secret.
And the messages then get worse.
Someone on mine's just said, hi, have you been raped yet? I mean, that's absolutely disturbing.
Next one there.
Guest, 1969, you know, so, I mean, he's clearly doesn't fall within the age range for this website, does he? I'm 56, male from the UK, is that okay, please? Wow, cool. You know, what's cool about that? You know, you're a 56-year-old man.
And what are you writing there?
Hey, I'm only 13.
Say if you were sat here for 8 hours, how many men would contact you and then get explicit?
Literally hundreds, like, that's not even a joke.
Talk about the impact it's had on you.
You know, there has been points throughout these couple of years where we've both taken antidepressants because of stuff that we've seen and that. I mean, like, myself personally, I've been sent 2 indecent images of children now.
As the messages continue, one man then asks to meet us.
I've got one, Brian from Carlisle. He's been sending messages of an explicit nature. Do you want sex?
Despite living 60 miles away in Carlisle, he wants to come to Newcastle. Within seconds, that meeting is now arranged.
He said he takes regular trips to the RBI and is wanting to meet because he's taking a family member there, and he basically goes on a 45-minute break while the family member is in the hospital. He thinks he's going to be meeting a 13-year-old child.
In the time I've been here, the fake profiles have received hundreds of messages and a number of indecent images, and we've now agreed to meet a paedophile. And all of that took less than 1 hour. Now, for 2 weeks' time, we've arranged that meeting where we'll come face-to-face with Brian.
He'll be waiting in a specific place, and he'll be thinking that this girl's going to be turning up, and instead of a girl, it'll be us 2 ugly mugs.
I feel a bit sick. I don't know about you. It's so easy. It's so quick. So many of them. Like a cesspit. And Martin Lindsay will be with Scott and Callum from Dark Justice when they go to that arranged meeting and find out whether or not Brian does decide to use the 45 minutes he has spare as a family member is in the local hospital to meet up with a young person he believes to be, a young girl he believes to be 13 years old. Every day as well. The lads will be with us from 12, and we'll catch up with Martin later in the show as well to find out the journalistic angle on this, the journalistic element. It's coming out to 11:15. My apologies to Rezwan, who's been waiting to talk about Saudi Arabia. We will move on to that after the break. It's an odd one, actually, and in a way we can't do this every day because I'd be talking myself out of a job. And, of course, it doesn't apply as well to this, to all other issues as it applies to this issue. But the idea that you have to pick a side, the idea that you have to be either with them or against them, it just doesn't work in an intelligent world, does it? Because today we're rolling out the red carpet for someone, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Theresa May will be having tea and biscuits with him. Her Majesty the Queen will be having a meal with him as well. Incorrigible FCA, my pocket pedant, points out that the Queen could actually refuse to have contact with a foreign head of state. It would then be up to the Prime Minister whether or not it was escalated to a sort of constitutional crisis. Of course she could. She's not a hostage. But I don't think she would. And that's the point, isn't it? What's the difference between the leader of... What's the Kim Jong-un and the leader of Saudi Arabia while we're here? Anyone? Morally? Because we're supposed to despise and fear one of them while roll out the red carpet for the other one. Ethical foreign policy? Yeah. And we're sort of, I suppose, paying a sort of subtle homage to the late Robin Cook, who promised as Foreign Secretary to pursue an ethical foreign policy in one of Tony Blair's first cabinets, and subsequently in a different role, I think he was leader of the House, resigned from the front bench of politics in protest at the decision to go to war in Iraq, which hindsight has taught us was profoundly unethical. So as the Saudi royal family make their way to Buckingham Palace today, where is the ethics in this? 600 million quid's worth of weapons already used in Yemen, a civil war that is arguably the largest man-made humanitarian crisis on the planet. What does ethical foreign policy look like? And what is the difference between the people that we're told are our mortal enemies, like Kim Jong-un or Ahmadinejad in Iran a couple of years ago, and the people we're told are our sworn allies, like the bloke from Saudi Arabia? And Vladimir Putin, who is clearly corrupt and responsible for the deaths of British citizens and people of Russian extraction on the streets of our own cities and the streets of our own towns, he seems to go largely unpunished. Strange times, which is why this increasing urge, this exhortation to us all to pick a side, seems even more dangerous today than it does most days. Why would we have to pick a side? Because if you pick a side, you give a free pass to the bad behaviour of your lot. And that, I guess, ultimately is how a crooked, multiple bankrupt who was allegedly having an affair with a porn star shortly after his youngest child was born can end up in the White House. Rezwan is in Woking. Rezwan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
Very well. Puzzled.
Good. Yeah. Basically, I was listening to your program and the way you sum up everything about the Saudi regime, it's quite nice, but I think the few things you missed.
Go on.
And one of them is, I think, the top of the list, which is a very basic and important human right for everybody.
Yes.
In Saudi Arabia, if you're a woman cannot marry with anyone except Saudis. Right?
You have to be a Saudi national to marry a Saudi woman.
Exactly. Yes.
But a Saudi man can marry whoever he wants.
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Oh yes, sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Are you from Saudi yourself? Are you? Where?
No. I'm originally from Pakistan.
Okay.
Yeah, and the second thing, you cannot buy any property there, right? Unless the Saudi is your partner. You cannot buy a house. No matter if you have the money to buy a house, but you need to have like a Saudi partner to get this house.
Do you know?
Right?
I think, and I could have got this wrong because I find it slightly hard to believe. I think that was true in. Wait, that was true in Britain until 1975.
Really?
You couldn't get a mortgage as a woman in Britain unless you had the permission of your husband or your father, until the Sexual Discrimination Act in 1975. 4 years later, we had a female prime minister. So I mean, it's a curious juxtaposition of circumstance. But yeah. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. And another thing is, like, no matter even if you are born there, you're living for 1 decade, 2, 3, 4 decades, you cannot be their national. That's also one thing. And
yeah, I understand all this. I don't know if it counts as oppression. It's a sort of soft nationalism, isn't it? But in terms of Iran, for example, or even ISIS, and the oppression of women, as you've described, the criminalisation of criticism, the fact that you could get locked up in Saudi, Iran, in ISIS you get tossed off a building if you displease them on a completely arbitrary level. What's the moral difference between those three regimes?
Iran is slightly better than Saudi. You know, the people who visited there, I mean, I've never been to Iran.
You think Iran is better than Saudi?
In some cases.
But you've just done that picking a side thing.
No, I'm not picking the side. I'm just, as I heard from some people, they have visited, Iran and Saudi Arabia. They think, I'm just expressing their opinion to you, that they think that Iran is slightly better than Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Another thing I was just thinking, the way when the Donald Trump was here,
yeah.
Someone interviewed him. Do you think that someone will interview this Crown Prince as well? Not like the Pierre Morgan kind of interview, some better interview,
Don't be so rude about Piers.
No, because I was like, I think I could have interviewed.
No, mate, are you being daft? You're yanking my chain. The idea of a Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia exposing himself to an interview with a proper journalist is palpably absurd. You know that, though. Oh, hang on, he's on line 4. I don't believe it. He's just rung it. No, he's not. There's no chance at all, because he'd be asked about everything. He'd be asked about imprisoned dissidents. He'd be asked about murdered journalists. He'd be asked about women who've only recently been allowed to drive cars. He'd be asked about the 600 million quid's worth of weapons deployed in Yemen, some of which may be in contravention of various international laws. Put it this way, Rezwan. Rezwan, put it this way, mate. If you were the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, would you want to be interviewed by me?
No.
There's your answer. It's 10:55. Phil's in Ealing. Phil, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. I just want to talk about comparing Saudi to Iran, and probably the reason that we support Saudi is because we're not an expansionary power. If you look at Iran, they're active in...
what is Saudi doing in Yemen?
Well, no, so let me finish. The Iranians are active in Yemen, Iraq...
but the Saudis are in Yemen as well.
They are. If you look at the map, you'll find that Yemen is like Portugal is to Spain. It's the same landmass. They're a peninsula, and Yemen is... But
you said Iran are expansionists because they're in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia aren't expansionists, and I said, but they're in Yemen as well.
Well, you could take that argument, but...
It's not an argument, mate. It's a statement of fact.
Okay, Iran surrounds Saudi, and Saudi does not surround Iran.
Well, that's geography.
An expansionary power. That's geography.
It's not going well, this, Phil.
Well, look at the map. What's happening in Yemen?
Allow me to ask why you rang in to defend Saudi Arabia and pose Iran as a worse... Are you? I mean, can I ask what your personal politics are?
I'm a conservative, but that's kind of beside the point, really. Saudi Arabia
is it? Because you said we when you rang in. You said we. Why do we support? Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked. So, what you've got on your little conservative crib sheet, is Iran is expansionist and Saudi Arabia is not. Therefore, we will be nice to Saudi Arabia and sell them lots of weapons while demonising Iran. And your line for explaining why Iran is expansionary, first line you used, they're in Yemen.
Lightning to the Saudis. In the noughties, Blair sold Typhoon to the Saudis.
We've already covered that the hypocrisy spans all regimes and all British parties. So I'm just intrigued. You'll forgive me for not letting you off the hook on this one. How can Iran's evidence of expansionary ambition be their presence in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia's presence in Yemen be proof that they're not expansionary?
Well, they're supporting the rightful government of Yemen, which is literally on the same landmass as they are, and the Iranians are supporting rebels to the established state.
But they're both expansionists, mate. They both are defending their own interests, they would argue, by supporting warring factions in a foreign country. Mate, I think you need to get back onto Central Office and find out what's supposed to be on page 2 of that crib sheet. Bless. Mike's in Marlow. Mike, what have you got?
Well, I think we're very hypocritical as a company.
No, we're not. One side is expansionist and the other side is not, even though they're fighting a war in the same country. Do keep up, Michael.
Well, I know. I mean, listen, the bit that always made me smile was Mugabe. I mean, one minute he was a nasty despot and we're taking away the knighthood that we gave him a few years earlier.
The Pope gave Jimmy Savile a knighthood. This could be a lot. We could be here all day, couldn't we?
I know. But isn't it hypocritical? That's the point.
Yes. So why do people like Phil? Why do people like Phil the last caller? Why do people like that? And there are a lot of them. Is how I kind of was able to take a very easy guess at his political background. Why do they have to believe that there are two sides here rather than just interchangeable bad behaviour? Some of whom give us lots of money, so we'll pretend that they're not bad, and some of whom don't give us lots of money, so we'll portray them as much worse than the people who do give us lots of money. Is it that simple?
Yeah, I think we can stomach them because of the money. When Mugabe turned, Rhodesia into Zimbabwe and then turned it into a basket case rather than the bread basket, we've got no interest in him then, have we?
And I think when he chucked out the... Did he chuck out? Was it no, I'm getting him mixed up with Idi Amin. That's easy to do, actually, and but that's another brilliant example, because there would have been a point in not too distant history where Mugabe was held up as a friend and Amin was held up as an enemy, and yet their behaviours in their own countries would be comparable.
Exactly. I think. Absolutely.
I've got a problem, Michael.
What's that?
Well, the next hour I want to ask about why we can't punish Russia for killing people in the middle of Shrewsbury. I think the answer might be the same as the one we've just arrived at during this hour.
I think so. I'm just scared to death of Putin, to be honest.
Well, that and the money.
Yeah, you want to come over here and kill people? That's fine.
Yeah, in you come, mate. I'll hold your coat. I'll hold your coat. You just go over there and start killing British people. That's fine. Happy days. Maybe it's because Russia's not expansionist, Mike. That'll be it. They're all right, you see.
Oh, hang on. We haven't got an arms deal with them.
Not yet. It's coming up to 10:59. You're listening. Well, it's just gone 10:59. That rising crescendo in the background tells us that the news headlines are on the way. In the next hour, I'm going to ask a completely different question about a completely different set of circumstances involving a completely different foreign regime, to which the answer will be completely identical to the one we've just heard. In the words of Jerry Maguire, is it? Show me the money? Is that? No, it's Cuba Gooding Jr. talking to Jerry Maguire. No, too many cultural references. We're supposed to be talking about Middle Eastern politics and drawing parallels with the Kremlin kleptocracy. We've ended up referencing a Cuba Gooding Jr. catchphrase in a Tom Cruise film. Only on this programme, my friends. Only on this programme.